So good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the VF Franchise Consulting team, I would like to welcome you all to our webinar today. We have three knowledgeable speakers. We have a very interesting topic, why you should consider Southeast Asia for your franchise. My name is Robert, and I'm the Director of Business Development for the VF Franchise Consulting team, and I will be your MC today. Just a few notes. There will be a question and answer session at the end of our presentation after all of the speakers have completed. You may type your questions in, though, at any time during the presentations in the question box at the bottom of your device. Please end them with a question mark, and they'll automatically be stored for the Q&A later. So before we hand over to our speakers and their topics, we would like to take just a few moments to introduce our company to you. So our company has been operating throughout Asia for more than 12 years now, and we are rapidly becoming the go-to franchise and licensing consultancy for Asia. We are also very selective, and we will remain so in the projects that we accept and the brands that we represent. Our brands are well recognized, they're proven, they have very strong potential for growth and sustainable competitive positions. And most of our team, including myself, we work out of the Ho Chi Minh City office here in Vietnam. We also have a presence in Singapore and partners in many countries throughout the area, including Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Korea, and more. So whether you're a franchisor, whether you're a potential franchisee, or a company looking to expand in Asia, our experienced management team are very well qualified to help you achieve your goals. We are here at the center of Asia, especially Southeast Asia. We know this area very well. You can see some of our current clients on this next slide. We keep our portfolio quite small as they're handpicked by us. They're only ones that we are confident will be successful in our region of the world. And you can see some very well-known brands on there. Ace International, Helen Duran, Mathnasium, Texas Chicken, Little Caesars Pizza, Mango Tree, and also some smaller regional ones like SureClean or Cuco. And as you can see, our two main divisions for our brands are the education field and also the food and beverage industry. Now, our company has four main divisions operating in about 20 countries all across Asia. We have a franchise services division, a sales and marketing division, business consulting, and also franchise training. So our first division focuses on helping companies turn their brand into a franchise. So if you've got a good, profitable company, doesn't matter what the industry, and you want to expand using a franchise model, this is the division that can help you. And we basically help companies go through the entire process of expanding their business using the franchising or licensing model, right from the beginning of developing the strategy, right through making sure you have everything you need to do so, and of course, marketing it and finding you good partners at the end. The second division of our company is the sales and marketing. This really provides business development services throughout Asia for international brands looking to enter the region or Asian brands looking to expand in their own countries or in nearby countries also in Asia. And our specialty really is finding brands, area developers or master franchisees who are going to take a large territory or even a whole country to expand the brands that we represent, not just single unit expansion. And you can see here on the slides the countries that we operate in and focus on. Now, the third division is the business consulting division, and this focuses on other services for companies looking to make their businesses more efficient or profitable, expand their companies through attracting investors or joint ventures, or even sell their companies. We also assist brands who need things like market entry studies, competitor research, feasibility studies, and a variety of other short-term projects. And lastly, the fourth department, we offer some training, several different training programs, specifically about the franchising industry, like buying a franchise, how to do it right, why you need to franchise your business and how to do it. So topics are specifically tailored to audience needs and also the specific country where the students would be from. So that's a little bit about VF Franchise Consulting. We are based in Asia. We know the markets. We know franchising. And in normal circumstances, our team regularly travels around the region for our business matching events, expo shows, projects, and of course, webinars like this one. And we're happy to schedule private calls with you to discuss any of our services or to arrange a meeting when we're in your area. So now that you know who we are and kind of what we do, we are pleased to welcome our three speakers today. We have Mr. Sean Ngo, the CEO of VF Franchise Consulting. We also welcome Ms. Shore Han and Ms. Wao Pen on behalf of Tillicky and Gibbons Law Firm. But before we invite Mr. Sean to speak, once again, I'd like to remind you that we will have a question and answer session at the end of our presentation, and you can enter your questions at any time by typing in the bottom of your device. We will also follow up within the next couple of days with all attendees by email with some of the information that was presented today. So please keep an eye out for it in your email. So now let's introduce our first speaker, Mr. Sean Ngo, the CEO of VF Franchise Consulting, who's going to present the topic, why you should consider Southeast Asia for your franchise. He will then directly introduce the next speaker. Mr. Sean, please.
Thank you, Robert, for the kind introduction. Again, my name is Sean, and I am the CEO of VF Franchise Consulting. We're very happy to be hosting this webinar. When we host these types of topic, we get enormous interest, not only from within Asia, but throughout the world, as far away as places like the US, the UK, Australasia, Japan, Korea, etc. We're also very happy that we have two very, very knowledgeable legal eagles from Tillicky and Gibbons, and so they will be speaking shortly after my presentation. Real briefly about myself, I have a lot of experience. I won't tell you my age. There's obviously over 30 years of experience. I am Vietnamese American, and I have been back in Asia for over 15 years. And previously to my franchising life, which started with bringing in the first American hamburger chain to Vietnam called Carl's Jr., I worked a lot in finance, marketing, as well as in real estate for various companies throughout the United States. Many of you who are attending today are familiar with Southeast Asia, some more intimately than others. We do have participants as far away as India, Japan, and Korea, and Taiwan on this call. So hopefully these discussions about Southeast Asia and the intricacies of the franchising sector in these regions are helpful to you. And as you can see here, ASEAN is an amalgamation of basically 10 countries in this region. And as a whole, it really is a powerful and very significant market. You can see here that, as far back as 1980, we had a population of about 350 million people. Today, it stands closer to 700 million people. So you can see that growth rate, that population growth rate, kind of stabilizing around 1%. And that's pretty impressive because in most mature developed markets, for example, like the US, you're seeing a much slower population growth rate of about 0.6%. And in terms of the insights of that population in age groups, here you can see the bell curve as it looked in 2000 and 2018. Clearly, we had a very, very young population in the year 2000, and it's still relatively young in 2018. And in fact, the median age in Southeast Asia today is about 29, 30 years old, which is the same age, the same median age as it was in the US in the 1960s. Today, the US market, for example, has a median age of 39 years old. And in Asia itself, you can see that some of the markets in Asia, like Korea at 39 years old, like Japan, which is very, very mature. The median age there is 48 years old. You can see that Southeast Asia's population is quite attractive to many multinationals as an option in terms of further investments, which we'll see in the next few slides. And also, one of the key things about the region, outside of economics, of course, is the literacy rate. And here you can see across the board the significant changes from the year 2000 to the year 2017, with most countries scoring about 95% literacy rate or higher. There is some work to be done in a few other countries, more emerging, like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. But that said, these are very, very impressive literacy rates and the trajectory of the growth rates in the less developed countries. As an example, in the US, the literacy rate is about 98, 99%. So you can see that many Southeast Asian nations are catching up quite quickly. And in terms of the economy size, that 3.0 stands for 3 trillion US dollars. And today, as a region, ASEAN is the fifth largest region in the world, the fifth largest market in the world. And if you believe some reports from Goldman Sachs and the likes, in the next 2 decades, what you will find is that ASEAN will be bigger than Japan and Germany. And the only other change will be India. India will move into the top three economies. So basically, by the year 2030, 2040, we're going to find that the top four economies in the world are in Asia, including China, India, and ASEAN. And how does that $3 trillion market size break out between the different countries in 2018? You can see here Indonesia continues to climb, with Thailand being currently the second largest market in the region. But this is changing clearly, and as we'll see in later slides, we will find that Indonesia really is the grand prize of Southeast Asia. And you will find that also markets like the Philippines and Vietnam and Thailand continue to grow their market size and potential for international franchising, as well as many other industries. And really, what really makes up that fast growth economic power, of course, is looking at the real GDP growth rate across ASEAN. As a region, it is the envy of the world, right? It's growing as a region, 5.3% real growth rates each year from 2000 to 2018. That's a 19-year time frame growing at that impressive rates. And that's why you're starting to see the results of, higher economics and higher investments and higher living standards and literacy rates, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that within the region over the last 19 years, some of the countries, especially the emerging countries like Cambodia, Myanmar and Laos really outperformed despite the smaller size of the economies, but they're really growing at very, very impressive rates that are probably second to none throughout the world. And even places like Vietnam, which has 96, 97 million people for the last 19 years, has been growing on average 6.6%. Just truly incredible numbers for the entire region. And here you can see that has obviously attracted a lot of FDI. You can see that trajectory again over a 13-year time frame, with the top line there at $155 billion in the year 2018. As many of you know, many international companies, even within ASEAN and trade between ASEAN countries, a lot of FDI is moving to ASEAN outside of China. It's the China plus one policy, it's the China plus three policies. And the main beneficiaries have been countries like Cambodia, like Vietnam, like Myanmar, like Thailand, like the Philippines and Indonesia, and the likes. And we anticipate, and many experts agree, that this trend will likely continue as many international companies seek diversification and minimization of risks without being too exposed too much to mainland China. And from a tourism standpoint, wow, this chart really tells it all. I mean, Thailand continues to be a powerhouse, and for the foreseeable future, they will continue to be the powerhouse in Southeast Asia. But you can see even places like Indonesia, which has grown 3x over the last 13 years, and Vietnam, which has probably grown 4x over the last 13 years. You can see a lot of these countries that really didn't have sizable international tourism businesses, hospitality businesses, are now fastly growing, and making its presence known in Southeast Asia. But albeit in the next decade or so, Thailand continues to be the tourism hub of the region. And another thing that kind of tells you about how well countries are managing their economies and prosperity for the citizens that live there, you can see just amazing, improvements when it comes to the poverty and the reduction of poverty. Even places like Myanmar, which had nearly 1 out of 2 people in poverty in the year 2005, has cut that in half by the year 2017. No doubt, there remains to be significant improvements in countries like Myanmar, like Laos, but you can see many of the other countries are, around the 10% or even lower like in places like Thailand and Malaysia, which are really impressive numbers because at the end of the day, every country has, a poverty, uh, uh, a section that is below the poverty line. And even in the U.S., one of the most developed countries in the world, what we're finding is that their poverty line is 12%. 12% of the population in the United States is living below the poverty line. So these figures are truly, truly, impressive when you look at the amount of time it took to get to these figures. And we're going to talk a little about the internet economy and the internet subscription rates because in Asia, what we found out and seen, have observed and seen facts that show that hey, in Asia, we tend to be a lot more technically savvy than they are in the West, even in places where Silicon Valley was born in the San Francisco Bay Area where I grew up. Which has amazing amounts of companies, the Googles of the world, the Yahoos of the world, the Microsofts of the world, the Amazons of the world. But at the end of the day, what we're finding is when it comes to the digital economy, it's Asia that is beginning to rule. And you can see the internet subscription rates here at the top three are should not be a surprise. It's Singapore, it's Malaysia, it's Brunei, and then you also have countries like even Cambodia that is doing quite well with internet subscription, along with places like the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And then, of course, the rest with the emerging economies. And why this is important is because internet connectivity obviously is the basis for the size of the internet economy. In this day and age, we talk a lot about unicorns, companies with IPOs of $1 billion or more. And you can see here that, for the foreseeable future, we're going to see Indonesia dominate the internet economy within the region. But we can also see that places like Thailand and Vietnam continue to show 3x, 4x growth from where they were in 2019. And in a short 6 years, by the year 2025, we're going to see very, very impressive numbers. And even the other countries from Malaysia to the Philippines to Singapore, we're seeing, significant growth just over the next 6 years. So again, this is all driven by the fact that we have a very connected society as a whole. And where is that $300 billion in 2025? Well, this is how it breaks down to e-commerce businesses. Travel has gone online, as we all know. The ride-hailing services, the Ubers of the world, the Grabs of the world, and of course the rise of deliveries and food deliveries and the like, as well as online media and social media spending. All of this continues to grow significantly. You can see that it 3x from 2015 to 2019. It once again 3x again from 2019 to what we believe in 2025 will be a big economy with $300 billion in this sector. And one can only imagine by the year 2030 what this number could be. It could well be well over 1 trillion US dollars. With that, we'd like to kind of briefly talk about the main countries within Southeast Asia. And of course, when we talk about Southeast Asia, most people who are not familiar with the region bring up Singapore. And rightfully so. Singapore does not look like the rest of Asia, to be honest, right? I mean, it looks like a developed country anywhere in the world, except Singapore is even richer than they are. So that's the unique thing about Singapore is that it's a very developed economy. It has a very developed franchise industry, lots and lots of franchise systems. At last count, there were over 600 plus. There are probably more today. And of course, throughout every segment, every sector of franchising, you will find in Singapore, whether it's F&B, in hospitality, in the hotel sector, in services, in education, etc., etc. One of the nice things too, and I'm sure Tilakey and Gibbons will comment on this a little bit later, is from a legal standpoint, Singapore is one of the easiest countries to work in, especially given since they do not have any franchise-specific laws. And many countries, especially if they're coming from further away, and if their ultimate goal is to get into mainland China, what they have found is that going to specific countries in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, like Malaysia, it can serve as a beachhead, as a test market, you know, prior to actually entering a very difficult market like mainland China. So, and obviously that's due to the fact that the ethnicity, the speaking of Mandarin as the language of choice in the countries of Singapore as well as Malaysia, even though both countries, you know, speak perfect English. You know, it is an advantage to go into these markets first prior to entering a very, very different market in mainland China. And as mentioned earlier, Malaysia is, you know, in effect, a bigger Singapore. Not quite as prosperous from an economic standpoint, but certainly a much larger population, which gives it, albeit a bigger importance when it comes to the economy and its influence within the region. Again, with a population of 33 million people, with a very diverse ethnicity group, you know, with Malays being the majority of the population, but also the Chinese population, the Indian population, as well as many various other minority groups that live and work and prosper in Malaysia. Again, a very similar story, a very developed franchise industry with over 900 systems already in place, and also, you know, a very large economy. Now, that said, if you are in the F&B sector, because of the Muslim majority, you know, population in Malaysia, it is very, very important to have halal certification. So again, you know, if your business is not in F&B, this shouldn't be much of an issue. But if it is in F&B, it probably makes sense to consider this key factor as part of your decision to enter a market like Malaysia. In Indonesia, as we mentioned, you know, with a population that is approximately 270 million people, that makes it the fourth largest country in the world, and that will stay that way from now until the year 2050 for sure. And so, you know, it's a huge, huge country, broken into, you know, many different islands, and again, just the prize of Southeast Asia in terms of FDI, in terms of franchise attractiveness based on the size and the economics of the consumers, and again, a very developed franchise industry. But also another country where halal certification is a must. But quite honestly, we do not have any clients that is not already Indonesia that does not want to be in Indonesia. And usually the number one priority when it comes to international brands that seek to enter this region. And Thailand, you know, again, has the second largest economy in Southeast Asia, very, very developed franchise industries. You know, all the major franchises can be found in Thailand. You know, you name it, it is here. Of course, the key cities of focus when people want to enter Thailand is the greater Bangkok metropolitan area. And quite easy to get into franchising in this particular market due to the fact that there are no current franchising laws. Now, it is the same with Thailand as it is with many countries throughout the region. There are lots of drafts about franchising laws, but until they are introduced, it is quite easy and efficient to establish a franchisee and to start your franchise business in places like Thailand. And the Philippines is also another one of the ASEAN six countries where it is just a economically a very powerful uh, country in terms of its influence in the region. It is arguably the most developed country when it comes to franchising. Just lots of locally grown owned franchises coming out of the Philippines. We hear the likes of Jollibee and similar companies coming out of the Philippines, but really, I mean, there are just literally thousands of very entrepreneurial franchise operations that come out of the Philippines, and it contributes significantly to their GDP. And in 2018, it was estimated to be about 7% of their GDP. One of the unique things about the Philippines, too, is that it is very, very pro Western, but also that includes, brands from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the like. So it's very pro Western, very pro international. When it comes to their choices for new franchise opportunities. And one of the nice things too is that the Filipino community has a big overseas, community overall. It's over 10 million Filipinos living and working overseas. In the U.S., for example, it is, I believe it's about 4 to 5 million Filipino Americans in the U.S. alone. So uh, lots of um, lots of connections with the West, but not only with the West, obviously, because you can see Filipinos working and living throughout the region as well as greater Asia. And Vietnam is, in many ways, a little bit similar to the Philippines in that respect, in terms of the Vietnamese diaspora living abroad. Many left, in the 1970s and 1980s. But also, what you find is, while it's not a nascent industry anymore, the franchise industry is beginning to develop and grow, right? And as of earlier this year, there were a reported 235 foreign brands that registered their trademarks in Vietnam. And they span all across the various sectors that you normally find in franchising, in F&B and education and services, etc. You'll find the McDonald's of the world here, the Starbucks, the KFCs, the Texas Chicken, the Pizza Hut, the Domino's, etc. So, very pro-Western, very similar to the Philippines in that respect, and also quite a sizable population. I forgot to mention the Philippines has 100 million people. I mean, that's a very big country. And Vietnam is right behind that at 96 million people. So just very, very interesting, economic potential for both countries. In fact, Goldman Sachs predicts that by the year 2050, uh, Southeast Asia will have four of the, I'm sorry, three of the top 50 economies in the world. And standing at number four continues to be Indonesia. Number 19 will be the Philippines. And 20, Vietnam caps it off at number 20. So, I mean, in terms of the top 20 economies in the world, you'll find that we are well represented. And if you look at the top 50, uh, probably 80% of the countries already in Southeast Asia and ASEAN are included in that top 50 per that report. And some of the key cities that many international franchisors consider when they first enter Vietnam is Ho Chi Minh City, and then Hanoi, and then a very distant third, fourth, and fifth are the other cities that we mentioned: Da Nang, Haiphong, and Can Tho. I would say for international brands, 80 to 90% of the brands, when they enter, they come into Ho Chi Minh City as their choice, unless they find or have a partner who is based in the north in Hanoi, where they can potentially decide to start there first. And Myanmar, and the next few countries, we're going to go very quickly with Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. And the reason is because they're all very nascent franchise industries. You do have some key players there, like the KFCs here, the pizza company, which is from Thailand, is there, and we have brands like Wall Street English, which does very well there in Myanmar. But you can also see that there's enormous growth for opportunities for growth. They have a very large population similar to Thailand, and there is a special relationship that Thailand has with countries like Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia due to the sharing of culture and history, and the fact that they're just right next to one another as well. So, a great country with lots of potential. Our company, we did a business matching very early this year in 2020 before the COVID situation, and there was significant demand for new franchise opportunities in that market. And there continues to be very good demand for that market. And the same can be said about Cambodia, albeit on a smaller population of about 17 million people. But from a franchise industry perspective, significantly more developed than what even Myanmar is today. And again, you can find the largest players in places like Cambodia. And the key cities there that people focus on is Phnom Penh, and again, a very distant second is Siem Reap. But lots and lots of opportunities, whether it's in education or F&B or retail or any other sector that has very limited competition for the time being. And then we'll cap it off here with the countries with Laos. Again, Laos is probably has the most nascent franchise industry in Southeast Asia. And there is some presence with international brands like Lotteria from Korea, Pizza Company, Texas Chicken. In fact, we helped Texas Chicken get into Laos a few years back. But again, probably not a priority if you are not already in other parts of Southeast Asia. Now, we only have a few slides left, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room because, you know, uh, we've heard of COVID-19. We not only have heard of it, but we're hearing it over and over again everywhere we look, everywhere we see. But you can see here that for the most part, Southeast Asia as a whole did a wonderful job with managing this pandemic. Now, there are some areas in some countries where, they are trying to flatten the curve, and they're not quite there yet. And it's specifically Indonesia and the Philippines, which have seen the worst cases. But again, that could be based on many factors. And of course, they happen to have the two largest populations in Southeast Asia. So the size alone makes it extremely difficult to manage this. But I grew up in the States, and they have over 3 million cases, and over 140,000 deaths, right? And if you compare that to what the number of deaths has been in Indonesia and the Philippines, it's just a phenomenal job that they have done so far to manage that situation, given the resources that they have. Now, what does that mean to the growth rates? Now, earlier we talked about the growth rates and the potential, but obviously, we have a scenario here where we look at, what the baseline scenario might be in 2020 if everybody that we trade with does a good job, what the new GDP growth rates might be, and that's highlighted in blue there. And you can see here, like places like Vietnam, which pre-COVID was expected to have a GDP growth rate of 7% in 2019, and they were expected to have a similar growth rate in 2020. But you can now see that COVID is taking its toll, and it's in all honesty, it's looking like it's more similar to the lowercase scenario, where you will see some growth in places like Vietnam, Cambodia, China, but you may also see some negative shrinking of the economy in a few countries as well. And for those that are based in those countries, you can now see that there are opportunities to continue to grow in these other areas in other countries. And this is the new reality based on the new COVID world. You're looking at, if you're an F&B, eating at home is a priority now. And again, if this is something that you are in this segment, you got to be notice. You got to take notice of this emerging trends that are likely to stick around for a while. And again, this talks to the online transportation and delivery, food delivery market size. While the numbers continue to be not substantial, in places like Malaysia or Vietnam at $2 billion by the year 2025, it is slightly bigger in places like Singapore and Thailand in the Philippines, but you can also see the enormous opportunity here in places like Indonesia, right? And in many of these countries, you're looking at places like Vietnam and Malaysia, for example, they're expected to grow 10x what they were in 2015, and that's not bad. And then you look at places like Indonesia, that's going to, or at least it's forecasted to grow 14x. And then lastly, just a summary on retail rent within Southeast Asia. Rent is particularly high in a few key countries, and of course, you have Singapore, which can be well anywhere from 200 to 300 US dollars per square meter for Orchard area prime CBD rent. And you see similar rental rates for retail in Bangkok as well as in Ho Chi Minh City, right around the 120, $130 rent. Now, for sure, some of this rent has softened a bit based on the times that we are in, but obviously all things must come to an end, and we do expect that rent continues to be a challenge if you need to be in the CBD, if you need to be in grade A areas and facilities. And lastly, before I hand it off to Tilakey and Gibbons, speaking about the law, some final thoughts. Again, what we find in this region is that labor costs are generally much cheaper than they are in more developed markets. But at the same time, there's more pressure on cost of goods sold and raw materials because there is a higher likelihood of importing those raw materials into the countries where the franchisee operates. You have to watch the rent You know, and sometimes maybe those rental costs, expenses may dictate where you want to place your businesses and your franchises. As a general rule of law, the smaller space requirements that you require will be a big advantage for you. All right, and we're starting to see obviously a lot of retail formats, store formats, doing delivery, doing takeaways, and that has been able to not only reduce their rents but also increased you know their access to the digital economy. And again, in places like in Indonesia, Malaysia, a halal certification is a must. Uh, and the last thing I want to say is the last 2 points, and that is, you know, when you're expanding to this region, it is not the U.S., it is not the U.K., it is not Japan. You know, you have to be realistic in the terms and conditions that you offer. You know, because not only are you competing with regional brands that want to get in, you're competing with local brands that want to expand in their own territories, and you're competing with brands as far away as Europe or the US or Canada or Australia, and they are all offering very competitive terms. So you have to look at it in that perspective. And then one of the key things that franchisees look for when it comes to new franchise opportunities is, of course, you know, a support team. And so it is, you know, you need to have a good story. You need to have, you know, a good plan that if you don't have a support system in place in the region, or if you're not based in the region, that you have a plan in place to help support franchisees as you roll out you know, the services, the training, the operational support for new franchisees in this region. And if you need that support and you don't have that support, you know, you can look at consultants, obviously including ourselves, for these types of services. So with that said, you know, I want to go ahead and switch it over and hand this over to Miss Walpen from Tillicky and Gibbons. I won't mention too much about it. I think Ms. Walpen will be able to introduce you to Tillicky and Gibbons.
Okay, hi Sean. Thank you for the introductions and good afternoon, everybody. Today, I and my colleagues in Thailand, Johan, we will walk you through and discuss about legal and practical overview regarding to franchising activities in Southeast Asia. And then, before we go through with the details, please allow us to introduce ourselves. Like for myself, my name is Walpen Premvichai. I'm a Thai qualified lawyer, which have been practicing in Thailand for 7 years, and now I'm practicing in Vietnam for 6 years already, and I'm a foreign registered attorney in Vietnam. Related to our firm, our firm provide full legal services like related to operations of business in Vietnam. We provide 3 core practices. First one, corporate and commercial department. So we help you to enter the market, explore the regulatory requirement, review contracts, and so on. And then we also have intellectual property department, which also help you deal with your intellectual property registration and any dispute. And lastly, dispute resolution. So we can help you through the litigation process in case of any dispute. Related to our firm, we have been established over 130 years already in Thailand. Our headquarters is in Thailand, Bangkok. And then, as you may see, we established for a very long time, over 100 years. So we have very experience in providing legal services. And for the long history is proof our success in the business as well. Like so far, our firm have 7 offices throughout 7 countries in Southeast Asia. Our headquarters is in Bangkok, and then we have 2 offices in Vietnam, one in Hanoi and one in Ho Chi Minh. And also we have offices in Jakarta, Phnom Penh, Vientiane, and Rangoon, Myanmar. And we have 190 lawyers and consultants. Related to franchising activities, we have very strong practice and to advise our client who would like to enter into market. We help a lot of world famous brand to enter into this region, including food and beverage client like Subway, Krispy Kreme, Cold Stone. Related to fashion industry, we also help Kohan, Fossil, Gap, Banana Republic, Mango. Education, we help a few academy like First Court Academy, Edge Learning Center, and in retail, we also help Tesco to expand the business throughout the regions. Next, we go to the objective, like the topic that we would like to highlight with you today. We will speak basically 3 main topics. First one, we will guide you through the differing perspective between franchisor and franchisee, like reminding you what is the main issue that franchisor and franchisee see when it's come to franchise relationship. Second one, guide you through an overview legal and regulatory requirements related to franchising activity throughout Southeast Asia. Like in this case, we will discuss about rules of the law related to Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. And for myself, I will guide you through with the registration requirement in Vietnam, and then my colleagues in Thailand, Shahan, she will walk you through the regulatory requirement in other jurisdictions. And lastly, we will also discuss about develop techniques like based on experience to help you arrange for structure and negotiation successfully with your franchisees in Vietnam. Let's discuss about first topic, introduction. What does franchise mean in terms of legal perspective? Like basically there are 3 main elements. What will make your arrangement will be considered as franchising activities. Like first of all, if your arrangement have permission to use intellectual property or business model for the franchisee to sell goods or services, so it will be one of the criteria to determine whether it's a franchising activity or it can be other type of business model. And then second element, it will be related to like if the franchisees agree to sell the goods or offer services based on the business model or procedure instructed by the franchisor. So in this case, it will be related to the control. Like if in the arrangement, you plan to have control over the business operation of the franchise business, or you would like to have control related to design or merchandise or the activities related to how the franchisee would like to operate the business. So this should fall under the second elements of the franchising activities. And lastly, if you also plan to have assistant for the franchisee, like for example, provide assistance in advertising, promotion, advisory, consultancy services related to how they can operate successfully the business. So all of these 3 elements will make the arrangement here in this case will be considered as franchise rather than other business model. And then if the arrangement is considered as franchise, you may have to check whether before you can grant the franchise business to the franchisee in Vietnam, it needs to have gone through with the registration process or obtained prior approval from the local authority before you can start the business. Secondly, let's discuss about common goals of the parties. The parties in this case is the franchisor and franchisee. When it comes to the franchising relationships, what are the common goals for the parties? First one, mutual benefits. So obviously that both the franchisor and franchisee would like to have success in business expansion and also successful in operating the business. This will be the ultimate goal for the party. Secondly, clear context and framework. Of course, you would like to discuss among the party, like how you would like to manage the relationship. What is the fee related to the franchising activity, support or obligation for each party. So these areas should have been clearly discussed before the party entered into the relationships. Third one, build trust and maintain confidentiality. Of course, when you start to build a relationship, you have to share a lot of information, especially the business method, business trade secret and formula and everything, how to attract customer. So all of it will be considered as trade secret. And of course, you have would like to have the party agree on confidentialities of these information exchange during the relationships. Next one, protect valuable IP, intellectual property items. Intellectual property is a very important element when it comes to franchising activities. The franchisee would like to use the brand name, trademark of the franchisor to operate the business. And it must be clearly discussed among the party who will be the ownership of the intellectual property associated with the business. And if the licensee, the franchisor will only have the license to use the intellectual property right, and then who will be ownership for the new intellectual property items developed or discovered during relationships. So this have to also be clearly discussed. And then go out of deal if not working. In this case, the party also need to clearly determine first, like how to terminate the relationships and what would be consequences. Like, for example, what would be the ground for each party to terminate the relationships or contract, and then what would be legal consequences, whether after termination, the franchisee still have the right to operate or be engaged in the same industry, or it will be restricted to do so. And then how about the existing business unit, like whether the franchisor would like to have the right to step in and take over the businesses in Vietnam. So these issues have to be discussed as well. Next one, allocate liability fairly. This one have to also clearly negotiate since the beginning who will take the liability on each issue, or they will share or have the joint liability. And last one, dispute resolution. The party also have to determine whether they would like to resolve the dispute in the local court or arbitration center, whether it will be the arbitration center in Vietnam or overseas. Next, mutual benefits, like the points that both the franchisor and franchisee usually share the same benefits. First one, rapid brand expansion. Of course, in this case, the expansion of business will be rapidly compared to the franchisor entered into the target location by itself, because in that case they have to set up the company and apply for relevant license and capital efficiently. The franchisor doesn't need to invest by themselves, so they just have to train and transfer the knowledge to the franchisee. And then innovation. So once the business have been franchised to the local area, so the franchisee can also help the franchisor to develop new innovation. For example, if it's related to food and beverage, the local franchisee can help them create the local menu, specialty dish, and something. And then when it's come to the franchisees goals, they want transparency, ability to research and investments, and proven business model. Like in this case, when they decided to go into the franchise relationship, so they have to select that the business model have been successfully operated overseas, and then there is a high possibility for them to follow the success in this business. Leverage brand recognition, brand building. If they decided to go with the franchise option, they can make a use of the well known of the brand and not have to like start building the brand recognition from the beginning. They can also make use of the management support and problem solving from the franchisor who is experienced business player and help them resolve the problem. Differing perspective, like the franchisor in this case, they would like the relationship to be non-exclusivity. Is meaning that they would like to open the franchise system to many franchisees as much as possible to help them expand the business. But on the franchisee side, they would like to have the exclusivity of the franchising services to make sure that they don't have to compete with other franchisees in the same location. Related to loyalties and fees, the franchisor would like to have the loyalty and fee as much as possible to ensure that they will receive income in the territory. But on the franchisee side, they would like to limit the loyalties and fee to just maximize their profit. Related to protections of intellectual property, the party may would like to negotiate, like for the franchisor, they may would like to have the franchisee cover the expense related to protections of intellectual properties in the country, because the franchisee is the one who operates the business. In the meantime, the franchisee may would like to have the franchisor to take care of this protection because they are the owner of the intellectual property. And also related to termination. So once the relationship is terminated, so the franchisor may would like to restrict the franchisee not to compete in the same industry. In the meantime, the franchisee may would like to remove the exclusive in this case, and would like to continue to be player in the business. Next slide. What does IP mean? IP in this case, like we discussed before, intellectual property is one of the key elements defining franchising activities. In particularly, the franchisor will have to grant the right to use intellectual property related to the franchise system to the franchisee. And then we will elaborate here what are the intellectual property items which could be licensed to the franchisee. First one related to intellectual creations. It can be patent, copyright, trade secret, know-how, business model. This one can be considered as intellectual property creations. And next one related to brand. It can be trademark, trade name, a well-known mark. This one as intellectual property, and then it will be very helpful if the franchisor clearly spell out in the franchise agreement what are the list of intellectual property that they would like to share or license for the franchisee to use, and then how they would like to protect these intellectual property items. Like they should make it clear that the franchisee will only have the right to use, but ownership of the intellectual property still remain with the franchisor. And then who have the right and obligation to protect this intellectual property in the territory against any third party. So next, move on to specific country, specific legal system related to franchising activities in Southeast Asian country. And the first one, Vietnam. So for Vietnam have a specific or standalone legal system for franchising activities. The country have a specific rules on how the foreign franchisor can franchise the services into Vietnam. And then you will see here that there's a list of law and regulation related to franchising activities, and the most important one is the commercial law, and also second one is Decree 35 elaborating the commercial law regarding franchising activities. So when the parties prepare franchise agreement or terms and conditions between the parties, so they just need to make sure that the terms and conditions comply with these laws and regulations. Important requirements and tips for franchisor who would like to enter into Vietnam markets. So first of all, to be able to register the franchising. Also, and in this case, before the franchisor allow to grant the franchise to the franchisees in Vietnam, they need prior approval from the licensing authority before they can do the franchising activities. And then these are the conditions to determine whether the licensing authority will grant the approval or not. So first one, the franchisor must prove to the authority that the franchise system have been operated at least 1 year. So in this case, the licensing authority will see that the franchisor have been incorporated in the incorporation document at least 1 year, and also they have the existing financial statement for the last 1 year to prove this qualification. And then secondly, register the franchise system with the licensing authority. And if the franchisor is an entity overseas who would like to franchise into Vietnam, so in this case, they have to register with the central authority at the Ministry of Industry and Trade. It will be the central level. But in the second scenario, if the franchisor already have a company, subsidiaries company in Vietnam, and would like to use that company to grant the franchise to other entities in Vietnam. So in that case, they have to register the franchise system with the local authority of the province where the subsidiary is located. And next one, there will also be pre-contractual disclosure about franchise system at least 15 business days before granting the franchise or sign the franchise agreement. The law requires the franchisor to provide franchise disclosure document containing details about the franchise system and also details about the franchisor to the franchisee. And then next one, trademark license agreement. To have a successful registration, the franchisor need to prove to the authority that the trademark related to the franchise system have been registered in Vietnam. And then in case the franchisor is not the owner of the trademark, they need to have a trademark license agreement from the owner granting the franchisor the right to use such trademark for the system. And lastly, about qualifications of the franchisee. In case the franchisee is a company or business entity, the law requires that the franchisee must have a business line and registered with the licensing authority suitable for conducting the franchise business. For example, if the business is related to restaurant, so they need the business line of restaurant in the incorporation document. Next, about FDD contents. This is also related to disclosure obligation. The franchisor need to prepare FDD or franchise description document containing all the details required by law and provide to the franchisee and also registered with the franchising authority. Details of the FDD include general information of the franchisor, costs and fee payable by the franchisee related to franchise activities, obligations of the franchisor like assistant in training, support, and so on, financial statement, intellectual property items associated with the franchise. And then related to timeline for the registration, normally after the application has been submitted to the authority, it will usually take around 1.5 to 2 months for the officer to review and approve the application. And then only once the application has been approved, the franchisor can start franchising the services or the business to the franchisees in Vietnam. Related to tax, the standard corporate income tax in Vietnam is 20% and VAT 10%. But these tax rates only applicable to the entity incorporated in Vietnam or the franchisee, in this case, the one who operates the business, the franchise unit. But for the franchisor itself, because if the franchisor is a foreign entity, for example, franchisor is located in Japan or some other country, so they will be subject to a separate regime of tax, which is called foreign contractor tax. And then the tax rate will be classified into VAT and CIT as well. In that case, the VAT rate will be 5% and CIT is 10% for loyalty fees and 5% for other income earned in Vietnam. And related to termination, basically, it can be the ground as provided by law. For example, if the franchisee have been withdrawn with their business license or gone through the bankruptcy process, or it can be the ground as agreed by both parties in the franchise agreement. And once the franchise is successfully registered and grant approval from the authority, there will be a post-licensing requirement on reporting. So basically, when there is any change related to franchise system, they need to report to the licensing authority. If the change related to Part A of the disclosure document, for example, related to the trademark or related to license of the franchisor. So they need to notify that change, important change, within 30 days. But otherwise, other changes, they can just report annually once a year. And then next will be legal regulatory requirement related to other countries in Southeast Asia. And then my colleagues in Thailand, Shahan, will be the one who guide you through with these details.
Hi, everyone. It's Shahan speaking. Just a little bit of an introduction to myself. I am a Malaysian qualified attorney, and I'm currently based in Thailand, assisting franchisors from all over the world in relation to their entry and expansion into Thailand and also in in the regional market. So I work very closely with WellPen and also with the team at VF in relation to these matters. Now, in the next few slides, I will tell you a little bit more about the franchising framework that we have here in Thailand and also in a few other Southeast Asian jurisdictions. So we will now start with Thailand. So as Sean mentioned earlier during his presentation, there are no specific franchising regulations or no specific franchising laws in Thailand. But that being said, this does not mean that there are no other laws and regulations that would govern franchising relationships here in Thailand. So on this slide, you will see a list of laws and regulations that are quite pertinent in relation to your franchises here in the country. Now, in addition to the Civil and Commercial Code, we have the few pieces of principal IP legislation, which includes the Trademark Act, the Patent Act, Copyright Act, and also the Trade Secrets Act. And in addition to these, we also have the Unfair Contract Terms Act, the Trade Competition Act, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next few slides. And of course, we also have to take note of other potential restrictions governing foreign businesses and also laws governing taxation in the country. Okay, so before that, I want to also mention that in Thailand, the government has been thinking about enacting a specific Franchising Business Act. This started all the way back, I believe, in 2014, where it was proposed by members of the National Legislative Assembly, so the Parliament. But 6 years down the road, this draft law has not been enacted yet. People are saying that, you know, this whole idea could have already been shelved. And the reason behind this is because we believe that some of these provisions that they were planning to introduce through this specific Franchising Business Act, you can already find them in existing legislation governing business relationships here in Thailand. But I just want to tell you a little bit more about the draft that was available. One of the main requirements under this draft act is that there will be a registration requirement, but this act will not apply to foreign franchisors. Now, you must be wondering then why should you even be listening to this? Now, the reason behind this is because although this draft act will not, when it enters into force, or if it enters into force, will not apply to the agreements between you as a foreign franchisor and your Thai franchisee, it will still be applicable to the agreements between your Thai franchisee or your Thai master franchisee, and also with the in relation to the relationship between your master Thai franchisees and the sub-franchisees in the country. So there must be a registration done at the Ministry of Commerce, but more importantly, all franchise agreements must be made in writing. One very pertinent issue in relation to this draft is that there is this what we call the 2+2 rule, which is kind of mirrored on the old Chinese legislation, which is also reflected in some of the franchising regulations that you see in the region, for example, in Malaysia. Now, what is this 2+2 rule that we're talking about here? Firstly, the franchisor must be able to prove that the franchisor itself has operated at least 2 outlets profitably. Okay. Secondly, these businesses or these outlets must have already been operating for at least 2 years before you file the application at the Ministry of Commerce. So this requirement potentially stunts the growth or the expansion of your franchise in the country, because your first, so say your master franchisee or your first unit franchisee must be able to profit or must be able to demonstrate profitable business for 2 outlets for 2 years before they can proceed to appoint sub-franchisees. Okay, now, although we do not have that specific Franchising Business Act yet, in the end of last year, in December 2019, there's a set of new guidelines that was issued under the new Trade Competition Act. So these set of guidelines will be administered by what we call the TCC, so the Trade Competition Commission. So we call it the guidelines for the consideration of unfair trade practices in franchise businesses. Bit of a long name, but what it actually does is to provide an official definition of what a franchise is. If you look at this slide and the second bullet point, so we mentioned that the official definition of franchise will constitute 5 factors. Firstly, that there was a written agreement. Secondly, that there's a specified time period and a specified territory. Thirdly, that it involves a concept or a system or relevant IP rights. Fourth, a very important point is that there must be an exercise in terms of exercise of control over the operations according to the franchisor system. And lastly, that there must be a consideration. So we're talking about, for example, royalties, franchising fees in return. Now, this also means that a foreign franchisor cannot try to package the whole concept or the whole system as a license, or to try to call it a license just to circumvent the requirements under these guidelines. A very important requirement introduced by these new guidelines is that there must be a pre-contractual disclosure being done. Before this, in the absence of these guidelines, it is still general practice for foreign franchisors to provide a franchising prospectus or a franchise disclosure document to their local franchisees. But some of them would still not do that. But now with these new regulations, it is now compulsory. The guidelines also talks about what are the types of information that your disclosure document should include. So these includes information on payments and expenses that would be incurred, or those matters that are payable by your franchisee. So this could include advertising payments to the advertising fund, or training fees, or any sort of compulsory equipment that they are required to purchase. Secondly, the business model and also the types of services that the franchisor would be able to provide to the franchisee. Thirdly, intellectual property rights. So what are the trademarks that we're looking at? Or if you have a proprietary system, does it involve any specific patents that we are looking at? The fourth requirement, which your franchise prospectus should include, would be the relevant terms for renewing your franchising relationship, or the requirements in relation to amending certain terms within the franchising agreement, as well as terms in, relating to the cancellation, as well as the termination of your franchising agreement. One thing to highlight is that these new guidelines, although it mandates the in terms of providing this disclosure document, it does not state how soon or how early must you provide such document before the signing of the contract. Another important point in relation to this new guidelines is that the TCC will now be introducing certain prohibitions. So what we would constitute as unfair trading practices for franchising businesses. So these would include terms that would restrict the franchisee's business without justifiable reasons. For example, if a franchisor would require a franchisee to purchase certain products or services that could be deemed irrelevant to the franchise business, or if you require the franchisee to purchase more products or raw materials than what is reasonably required by the business. The guidelines also prohibit the franchisor from setting additional conditions for the franchisees to comply with after the agreement has already been executed. So you cannot request your franchisee to perform actions that are not explicitly stated in your franchise agreement. But there's an exemption, there's an exception. That is, if you are able to demonstrate a justifiable reason for doing so, or if you can justify that this is necessary to maintain the reputation of the franchise business or the quality and standards of the business. So there are a number of prohibitions, and I have just named 2, but the others would also include stuff like imposing certain tying or purchasing restrictions without, again, justifiable reasons. So for example, if the franchisee is able to obtain raw materials from other sources of a comparable quality but at a lower price, then as a franchisor, based on these guidelines, you are not allowed to prohibit them from doing so. Other prohibitions include restricting the franchisees from offering discounts on perishable goods. So these would typically involve, say, raw materials in relation to F&B products. Other restrictions also include stipulating discriminatory conditions among franchisees. So for example, if you do not have justifiable reasons, then your franchisee in Bangkok and your franchisee in Chiang Mai or Chiang Rai should be entitled to the same set of rights and obligations. Last but not least, the prohibition would be the franchisor is not allowed to set conditions that are deemed inappropriate unless it is to maintain, again, the reputation, the quality, and the standards of the franchise concept. So this is a very brief overview of these new set of guidelines that was issued under the Trade Competition Act. Okay. Now, a few other important points to talk about before we move on to the next jurisdiction. So there'll be a 15% withholding tax applicable, and a lot of countries would have the same withholding tax applicable when it comes to royalties, just at a different rate, and also subject to the existing double tax avoidance treaties, you may be able to reduce these tax rates. One thing that is very peculiar or particular to Thailand is that contribution to your advertising and promotional fund. So these monies that you collect from your franchisees, these will all be deemed as franchising fees. Or even if you require them to spend a certain amount of money every year to conduct their own promotion activities, even if you do not collect them directly, all these sort of fees or all these sort of expenses will still be deemed as royalties and therefore subject to the same level of withholding tax. 2 other things to take note of in terms of doing business, doing a franchising here in Thailand is that Thailand has very strict requirements or immigration requirements. So if, as a foreign franchisor, if you're going to send your trainers or if you're going to send your managers and employees to come to Thailand to train your local franchisee, then make sure that they fulfill the required work permit requirements. The last one would be to take note of the foreign business restrictions here. So when you include a takeover clause, and you should always include a takeover clause in your franchise agreements, we would recommend you including clauses or including the phrase or the local nominee. So, for example, if you say that the business is being wound up, or upon the termination of this franchise agreement, you would want the franchisee to cooperate in terms of transferring existing stock or transferring the lease to the franchisor or the franchisor's nominated entity. This is just so that you are not blocked from taking over the business due to the foreign business regulations. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Cambodia, also a very interesting emerging jurisdiction. So Cambodia does not have a specific franchising law, but we have to take note of the requirements governing the registration of your license agreement. Although there are talks that they will be enacting, right, a new commercial law that will include a provision addressing franchising. This is not yet in place. So for now, we still have to just take note of the license recorder requirements, both under the 2002 Act regarding marks, trade names, and acts of unfair competition, and also the very new 2020 notification on the recorder of license and franchise agreements. One thing to take note of here is that your agreements will have to include a translation in the local language, which is Khmer. And I also want to highlight another thing that is particular to Cambodia, that is, when you record licenses, these different IP licenses will not be recorded at the same government ministry. So if you are recording a trademark license, this will be done at the Department of Intellectual Property, which falls under the purview of the Ministry of Commerce. And if you are recording a patent license or a design patent license, this will be done at the Department of Industrial Rights, which is under the purview of a different ministry, which is the Ministry of Industry and Handicraft. And last but not least, if you are to record your license for copyright, these will have to be done at the Department of Copyright, which again falls under a different ministry, which is the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts. One additional point to just mention briefly here about copyrights is that Cambodia has just ratified the Berne Convention. So prior to this, Cambodia does not recognize foreign works of copyright. But with the ratification of these Berne Convention, foreign works will now be protected in terms of their copyright here in Cambodia, which is great news for foreign owners of copyright. So you must be thinking, but I'm a brand owner, right? So why do I care about copyright? Well, think about copyright in your materials, copyright in your franchising disclosure documents. If you are in the F&B business, perhaps copyright in your menu, or perhaps copyright applicable to certain designs and drawings that you have that could be related to your brand. So it's all very relevant. Okay, some other important requirements in relation to Cambodia, but most of these are very much standard if you have executed or if you already have existing franchise agreement templates that you use in other jurisdictions, especially in developed markets or other developing jurisdictions. Your agreement templates should already include this sort of provisions. So these are guarantee provisions relating to real estate, IP rights, advertising, tax, non-compete, dispute resolution, and the prescription period, the type of license, whether or not it's exclusive, meaning that you yourself will not be able to use these rights in the country. Non-exclusive, meaning that in addition to that particular licensee or franchisee, you as the licensor or franchisor will be able to appoint other licensees and franchisees for the same sort of rights. Or sole license, meaning that this is the only licensee or franchisee that you'll be appointing, but you yourself as the franchisor or licensor will still retain the rights to use the same set of intellectual property rights in Cambodia. Your franchise agreement should also include information on the period of the license, so the term of the license, and also, again, very important, control provisions. Basically, how would you, as a franchisor, exercise control over the operations of the business? And notarization of the signature, again, a very common requirement here across Southeast Asia. So I mentioned a couple of minutes back that Cambodia is mulling the enactment of a new law on commercial contracts, which includes a section on franchise agreements. So you can see on this deck that there are 5 important points that should be included if this new law is being enacted. But again, you will see that this has already been included in the previous deck the previous slide where I talked about the list of things that your franchise agreement should include in Cambodia. Moving on to the next jurisdiction of Indonesia, again, a very exciting jurisdiction. Sean did mention during his presentation earlier that if you're in F&B, you must really take note of the halal requirements here in Indonesia, and he's absolutely correct. Now, I want to talk about a few important points that foreign franchisors have to take note of when entering into a franchising agreement in Indonesia. Now, the good news is that actually Indonesia has a new set of franchising regulations. So these came into force in September last year. So it's fairly new. What is so great about this new set of regulations is that they have removed a few very stringent or restrictive requirements that were applicable in the past. So one of these requirements in the past is that for franchises, you have to source, I think, 80% of your raw materials or what they call your products, from 80% of which has to come from domestic sources. So you have to source these materials locally in Indonesia. But with this new regulation, this is no longer a requirement. So you can see in the 4th bullet point, we have mentioned here that there's no longer local content requirements. Another good news that we can see from these new regulations is that there's no longer a limitation on the number of outlets that each franchisee can operate. So in the past, I think they had a 2-tier requirement when it comes to local outlets. So I believe it's at 150 for a certain type of franchises, or 250 outlets for other types of outlets. But currently, with this new set of regulations, no limitation at all, which means that your local franchisee is free to operate as many outlets as they can, subject to your approval, of course. Again, there is a requirement for the agreement to include Bahasa Indonesia, which is the national language. Just to circle back a little bit to the top of this slide, there's a requirement for the franchisor to demonstrate that it already has at least 5 years of experience in the business. So we must remember that, when a country has a specific set of franchising regulations, these regulations are enacted to protect the local franchisees, right? So they do not want not just foreign franchisors, but also local franchisors who typically have deeper pockets or more experience in conducting business to take advantage of smaller business owners or individual business owners. So they want to be sure that these people, these businesses who are granting franchising rights, they themselves have the experience in running this business. So in Indonesia's case, the franchisor needs to have at least 5 years of experience. Now, there's also a registration requirement in Indonesia. So the franchisor needs to get what we call a franchise business registration certificate, or in Bahasa Indonesia, we call it Surat Tanda Pendaftaran Waralaba. And this will be, these sort of approval will need to be granted by the Ministry of Trade. An important requirement here is that you will then need to submit an annual report on the operations of your franchise to the Ministry of Trade. One thing that we did not include on this slide is that Indonesia also has a requirement for the provision of a disclosure document. So this needs to be given at least 2 weeks before your intended signing date. So this will allow your potential franchisee in Indonesia to have the chance to review it, to discuss it with their lawyers, for example, or their franchising consultants before they make that informed decision to sign that franchise agreement. Okay, moving on. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Laos. Again, a very interesting emerging jurisdiction. Laos does not have specific franchising regulations, but as with all countries that foreign businesses are seeking to enter, you must take note that just because there are no specific franchising regulations does not mean that a franchisor or a business owner can do anything or everything that they want to. So make sure that whatever contract or whatever franchise agreement that you're using, make sure that you have already localized it. Localize your template so that it is in compliance with local laws and regulations. I mentioned earlier that notarization is a very common requirement here across Southeast Asia, so that is another thing to take note of. International arbitration is possible, but foreign awards as well as court decisions are rarely enforced in Laos. So when we talk about the enforcement of foreign decisions like this, the general rule, okay, is to remember that it's enforceable as long as it is not contrary to local laws, local practices, local customs, okay? I'll talk a little bit also on the requirement to record your licenses. Now, there is no such requirement as to, okay, you must have already registered your trademark before you can grant a franchise. There is no such requirement, but it is always prudent to do so. So our advice is that before you appoint a franchisee or before you even think of appointing a franchisee, make sure that you have already put in your trademark application, or better yet, make sure that your trademark registration has already been granted. Okay, because in a lot of these jurisdictions, it's based on a first to file basis, which means that if you don't do it first and a third party who wants to ride on your goodwill goes ahead and do that, then it's going to take a lot of time and effort for you to successfully reclaim your trademark rights. And as with a lot of developing jurisdictions, or should I say emerging markets, it will take some time for these trademark prosecution or trademark registration process to complete. So we would advise you to start as early as possible so that when you're ready to enter into your franchising agreement, your trademarks have already been registered and you can then get your franchisee to sign a short form license, and then we can just record that at the IP office. Okay, the last point on this page, non-compete clauses are allowed. Well, as long as they're not too restrictive, as long as it does not unreasonably restrict the freedom of this third party in terms of conducting their business, then yes, all these non-compete clauses will be allowed. And they are very important, so you should always include them in your franchising agreements. I will also talk a little bit about Myanmar. Myanmar does not have specific franchising regulations, but in recent years, because of what we call an aspiring middle class in the country, we see a lot of foreign F&B brands entering to the market. We see a lot of educational brands entering into the market, and they're doing pretty well. So although Myanmar does not have specific franchising law, we need to take note of certain provisions within the competition law of 2015. Within this competition law, there are a few provisions that arguably restrict certain types of arrangements that are quite common, in fact, very common in terms of franchising relationships. For example, the competition law of Myanmar prohibits businesses from controlling the purchase or controlling the purchase or sale prices of goods and fees for services. But from the perspective of a franchisor, of course, you would want to set a certain, at least a range of when it comes to the fees payable for, say, your educational franchise, or you want to at least set the prices for certain food products on the menu of your F&B franchise. This is fairly common. So this is potentially problematic under the Competition Law 2015, but I can talk a little bit about that later on. Another example of what this competition law prohibits is that it does not allow business operators to restrict the opportunities in purchasing and selling of goods. So as a franchisor, it's very common for you to impose requirements related to getting, which source do you get your materials from, or which interior designer firm should you engage to do the mock-up or the overall get-up of your outlet. But the competition law of Myanmar prohibits that. So this is something that a lot of business owners in Myanmar are quite, for lack of better word, frustrated about. We are hoping that in the months to come, the new Competition Commission will be able to inject more clarity as to how would they interpret these provisions in relation to franchising businesses. So circling back to the examples of Thailand earlier, you will recall that I mentioned that the guidelines relating to unfair practices in franchising businesses, this is a set of guidelines that was introduced under Thailand's competition law, right? We call it the trade competition law. So we're hoping that in Myanmar, something similar will be done so that there will be more clarity as to what's going to happen to franchising relationships in the country. The second point, I just want to talk a little bit on the withholding tax. As I mentioned earlier, withholding taxes are applicable in most of these jurisdictions. So as a foreign franchisor who is not a resident in the country, that would be 15%. But again, this can be reduced based on existing double tax treaties. Okay, and the corporate income tax is 25%. For Myanmar, I do want to also talk a little bit more about IP rights. So for those of you who may be a little bit more familiar with the situation in Myanmar, Myanmar does not have specific IP laws that are enforced yet. So it took many years for the government, for the parliament to enact these new IP laws. And after a very, very long wait, last year in 2019, Myanmar now has 4 new IP legislation. So namely the trademark law, the patent law, the industrial designs law, and also the copyright law. So although they were all enacted early last year, they are not yet enforced. So what does it mean for foreign franchisors who are entering into the market? Well, again, this does not mean that there's nothing that you can do. There's always something that you can do. Let's start with the brand, right? The brand of your franchising concept. So that's when trademarks come into place. The first thing you need to do is to ensure that your trademark is already recorded at what we call the Office of Registration of Deeds, or the ORD. So make sure that you record them at the ORD. Why should you do it now? The reason behind that is so that when the new trademark law enters into force, you will have the priority right. You will have the priority right to utilize this special soft opening period to refile this trademark. Why is it important to do so? This is because Myanmar is going to have a first to file system, as I mentioned earlier. And if you don't file it ahead of others, it's going to take you a lot of unnecessary time and effort to reclaim your trademarks. So my advice to you is that if you had not done so already, register your trademarks in Myanmar now under this old system. And when the new law comes into force, refile it immediately. Again, why must you do that? The reason is because as a franchisor, you will also be granting the license to use your trademarks, right, to the franchisee. And under this new trademark law 2019, when it enters into force in the future, trademark licenses must be recorded at the new IP office. So by starting now, you can ensure that when this new law enters into force, you will already be ready to go. You will already be ready to refile it and then to grant your license and then record this license at the IP office, all in accordance with the new law. Another thing to take note of for foreign franchisors is that you can also record your trademarks at the Myanmar Customs Department. So under these old, what we call the Sea Customs Act, right? The Myanmar Customs does conduct seizures of potentially infringing items. So, but the requirement is that you must record your trademarks there. So to be entitled to record your trademarks at the Myanmar Customs Department, you must first get them registered at the Office of Registration of Deeds. So it's a two-step process. Okay, and you also need to rely on your contractual provisions. So make sure that your franchising agreements are being localized so that they include, they comply with local laws and requirements. Report and respond to threats of infringement. If you see any potential infringement, or if your franchisee notifies you of any potential infringement, make sure that you take steps to stop this sort of infringement. You should also always review the local use of your IP and your IP portfolio. Now, in Myanmar, although English is increasingly common in terms of it being spoken, the local language, Myanmar language, or some would call it Burmese, is still the most widely used language in the country. So as a foreign brand owner, you will also want to think of the possibility to actually localize your name or get a translation or transliteration of your name. So make sure that this, if you're going to do that, make sure that your IP protection also includes this transliteration. Last but not least, we would strongly recommend that you collect or you archive evidence of use of your trademarks or your brands or any of your materials in the country. So in case you need to take actions against potential infringers, this sort of evidence of use would be very, very helpful. This chart here is a comparison chart for all the jurisdictions covered earlier. We have also included an additional line for Malaysia, which we did not cover earlier. So I can talk a little bit about Malaysia while you look at this comparison chart here, right? Malaysia has a specific set of franchising regulations. In fact, there was a very recent amendment to the law. I believe it was just done earlier this year. The country has very, very stringent franchising regulations, actually. So, for example, as a foreign franchisor, you will need to be able to, or even as a local franchisor, you must be able to provide, I believe, 3 years of audited accounts to show that your business has been operating profitably. So based on our experience, a lot of foreign franchisors are not able to demonstrate this. So something to take note of before you enter Malaysia. Okay. Before we end, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about some sector-specific things to take note of. So for example, if you are in F&B, if you're in the food and beverage industry, you also want to take note of the requirements, right, regulating food products in each country. So in this chart, this table that you see here on the screen, this one relates to the situation in Thailand. But remember that each country has their own set of regulations governing food products. So make sure that you work with your local consultants in terms of understanding the actual requirements that are applicable to you. Okay, and also if you're talking about F&B, you might want to think of localizing your menu offerings and stuff like that. And all of this, think of all the potential IP protection that goes into it. So although you can work with a local franchisee in developing these new flavors or these new menu items, you want to ensure that you as a franchisor would still retain rights to this new IP. For the education sector, we also think about the importance of localizing your teaching materials, right? You want to make sure that it suits the local audience. Or if there's basically translated content, again, as the franchisor, you want to own, or you still want to maintain ownership of the IP rights in these translated content. So take note of that, ensure that your franchising agreement contains a robust IP provision to ensure that this is all taken care of. Okay, and a little bit on internet and social media. Sometimes what we see is that for a lot of very developed franchises, because they've been using templates from years ago, a lot of these old templates fail to include provisions governing internet use or social media marketing, stuff like that. So this is something to think about, right? When you enter into franchising relationships in this day and age, make sure that in addition to a robust IP protection section, you also include very clear provisions governing internet use or social media use. But at the same time, you don't want it to be too restrictive, right? Because from an advertising and marketing point of view, when it's too restrictive, if the franchisee needs to get your sign up for everything, you will potentially be missing out on a lot of potential marketing activities. For example, if you require a two-step process to get each social media post approved, then chances are you won't be able to respond or to write on certain, what we call like viral internet memes or viral content on the internet. You want to write on these new news. So make sure that while you have a proper protection in place, you don't want it to be too restrictive. So some other common risks across industries will be in terms of product licenses. Make sure that in your franchise agreement, you include very clear provisions stating that in the event of the expiry or termination of this franchise agreement, your existing franchisee must cooperate in terms of transferring any existing product licenses to you or your nominee. You also want to get them to sign, in addition to these franchising agreements, get them to sign additional NDAs or acknowledgement forms after each training so that you have additional document proof that there was a transfer of know-how. So in case something unpleasant happens down the road, you at least have all these additional documents to fall back on. So this is the last slide. So in terms of, just to summarize what we've talked about today, remember just 3 things. Firstly, no 2 jurisdictions are the same. So while you can always use your existing template, make sure that these are being localized before you enter into franchising relationships in each country. Secondly, always ensure that you have adequate IP protection. IP rights are territorial in nature. Just because you have your trademarks or your patents registered or granted in your home country does not mean that this protection extends to all these other countries. You have to take active steps to protect them and to register them in all these countries that you're expanding into. Thirdly, seek professional advice. Although there are a lot of materials out there on the internet these days, make sure that you seek professional advice, because especially in these emerging jurisdictions, the laws are always changing, right? The regulations are always changing. So you want to make sure that you know the most updated requirements in each jurisdiction. And you also want to know what are some of the practical requirements that local regulators would impose that's not being stated explicitly in the law. Okay, so this wraps up my presentation. Thank you very much for staying with us. And I will hand this back to Sean, right?
Thank you, Shorhan. Yes, yes, you do indeed hand it back to us. Well, I would like to thank both you and Walpen for this very informative legal overview. I know how challenging that can be just for one country, and the amount of coverage that you had for all of Southeast Asia makes it especially challenging. So thank you for both for doing a wonderful job. We are at our 2-hour mark. However, we do want to respond to a few questions. So again, if you have not asked your questions, go ahead and enter it in the box at the bottom of your screen. End it with a question mark, and it will allow us to see your question and to potentially select the question. So let's begin. We have a few questions already. So let's see here. This is an interesting question from Amy. IP can be registered, but how difficult is it to protect in practice?
Okay, it's Shorhan speaking. I can take this one. How difficult is it to protect in practice? Now, in certain countries, for example, in Myanmar, as I mentioned earlier, where there is still no proper IP framework in place yet, it is a little bit more difficult than in other more developed Southeast Asian jurisdictions such as Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia. So it really depends on the issue at hand, right, or the actual infringement at hand. But in each of these jurisdictions, there are so many ways of protecting your IP rights, of enforcing your IP rights, right? There will be civil enforcement where you could go to court. There's also criminal enforcement, which is quite commonly used in Southeast Asia. This is when we would work with government officials to conduct criminal raid actions. So if you are able to identify through investigations where are these warehouses or where are these stocks being kept, then we can work with government and with law enforcement officers to carry out these raid actions. There's also the possibility to use border control measures. So I mentioned earlier customs actions. So we can also work with the customs officers in each country to basically stop these infringing items from entering into the country. In some countries, we also have administrative actions. So instead of going to court, we can attend or we can handle these disputes at an administrative level, for example, at the IP office. So how difficult is it? It really depends on the scope of infringement in place. But the most important thing I would say is to ensure that you at least have your core IP registered. So have your core IP granted in the jurisdiction. Because without this, it's going to be more of an uphill task to enforce your IP rights.
Okay. The next question is from Tan. How long is the process to register my franchise in countries with franchise laws?
Again, it depends. So in Malaysia, for example, although I did not go into detail on the situation in Malaysia. The situation in Malaysia is that if you have all the documents ready, you'll be able to get it done within 6 months, sometimes even quicker, right? But the situation is that a lot of times when applicants submit their submission dossier, they do not actually fulfill a lot of the requirements, or should I say the very stringent requirements set by the Malaysian authorities. So we haven't seen situations where it took over a year for the franchising approval to be granted. But as long as you have your documents ready, we would say that this should be able to be completed in 6 months or so.
Irma asks, what strategies are taken so that existing franchises in Southeast Asia continue to develop in the medium to long term rather than just a momentary effort because franchise businesses require substantial capital for investors? So Shorhan, I think I'll take this if you
Yes,
don't mind.
please.
So that's a very good question, Irma, and it probably is a much longer answer to what I'm going to give you, but due to the limited times that we have, I think it really just boils down to having a deep pool of potential investors. And one of the things that we have learned over the years is that when franchisees stop investing, they stop building stores and centers, whatever the format is, it's usually due to lack of capital. And in times of crises like what we have, like what we are experiencing now, in 2007, 2008, there was a financial crisis. Before then, there was a financial crisis. And this pandemic has created a financial crisis for many businesses, right? And so what happens is if you do not have the deep, pool of applicants as franchisees, as investors to choose from, then you might end up with a franchisee that is less financially capable to weather these storms, right? So they may very well weather it under normal circumstances, but I think when crises like this happen, it makes it very, very difficult. So a very good question. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, we'd be happy to answer them offline. Sunil asks, can you also assist in identifying businesses or brand names to enter franchise in Thailand? Certainly we can. As franchise consultants, we represent quite a few leading brands across the US, across Asia, across Europe. So if there's an opportunity where we can discuss that and identify some key potential brands for your market in Thailand, we'd be happy to do that. And we can certainly advise you on other brands that perhaps we currently do not represent, but you may be interested in and where there may be a good fit in markets like Thailand. And so I'd like to end it with one more question, if possible. And this seems to be a good question. Tan asks, is now the right time to franchise my business? Should I wait until coronavirus situation subside? We get asked this questions a million times, and I'll answer it. Maybe Shorhan, you can, add to it if I've missed anything from a legal perspective or what you have seen, from Tilakey and Gibbons' perspective. But our advice to many businesses is that if you can, you should continue to seek additional franchisees. You should continue to seek expanding your business if possible. And the reason is one, this is an opportune time where your competitors may not have that luxury of being able to basically expand because of their priorities on managing the current business and the current situation. So if you are in a position to take on new initiatives, to take on a new effort to increase your presence in Asia or to expand your business to other markets where you are based domestically only in, then this may be a good time. But again, every group and every person is different. So this is probably a longer discussion than what we have in this webinar format. So again, with that, what I would like to do is this, because we are about 11 minutes over. What we'd like to do is encourage you to contact us again with any legal questions, with any franchising questions afterwards, and then we will schedule a one-on-one call with you to address them separately. And with that, what I would like to do is go ahead and pass you back to Mr. Robert.
Thanks, Sean. So on behalf of our team, everyone, we'd like to thank you all for attending today. We also, on behalf of the participants, would like to thank the three speakers, Mr. Sean, Ms. Shurhan, and Ms. Walpen, for their interesting and informative presentation. They give us a lot of details today that we can appreciate. As Sean mentioned, we will follow up with you by email, so keep an eye out for that. And please feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to discuss any of the franchising, business, or legal services that our two companies provide. And so on behalf of VF Franchise Consulting and Tilleke and Gibbons, we wish you a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy. And this concludes our webinar for today.